Welcome to another weekly market insight where we try to sift through the noise to get to the signal so you can have actionable advice and can make informed decisions. With me this week is Chris Ahrens from the investment committee. Chris, we're going to touch on a topic that I think some people have some strong emotions on. We're not trying to say anything that is good or bad. We're just trying to go through it as a data analysis and try to understand the pros and cons and where we are right now in this. So what is that? ESG. And we can see that there's been a lot of flow into ESG. And what is ESG?
Yeah, so that's environmental, social governance, and a lot of the flow has been in the environment side of ESG. And you can see really a large number, but some of that could be recharacterization of some of the funds. Because to get flows, you claim your ESG, maybe you get a little bit of extra flow.
Absolutely. The environmental, I also think of just kind of energy. But to your point, it's like there really isn't a lot of guidelines on what is ESG. And right now there's a big marketing campaign. We just had our CFA survey and they were asking a lot of questions about ESG. And I remember doing one a couple of years ago and they were asking a lot of things about smart beta and thematic. And I think that was one question in the survey. I'm not saying that ESG is going to go away the way that smart thematic, but there was a big push back then for marketing by a lot of the investment companies to sell that. And I think that certainly is part of the reason that we see so much recharacterization as ESG and so much flow into ESG.
And we're not really going to be talking about that at the specific fund level today, but that is something we do want to cover because there is a lot there. And a lot of myths actually surrounding, there are a lot of people saying you can earn excess returns by being in ESG, and we can lay out a case for, we do have enough data now to lay out a case for why that's incorrect. Right. You have to increase your cash flows or somehow say you're less risky in order to do that, but we think the opposite is probably true. You actually could be more risky. Right. But we'll make that case later.
So today we're going to talk about the energy component because that's so much in environmentalism. And it's not that any of these things are bad or wrong. It's just what is happening right now is we're making this transition. And I think a great case study is Britain's economy. If we go back to the 1990s, we can see most of their power, electricity generated, was from coal power. And then we get into 2000s and a lot of that coal power had been retired and they brought in natural gas. Now natural gas for a fossil fuel is very low cost, very low emitting of carbon and other pollutants. It's a good thing to have natural gas because it does burn cleaner. One thing though is a lot of times you're heating your home also. So if you're too dependent upon a single fuel, we can see some problems there. And then we get into 2010, we can start to see some of those renewables coming in. And it's mainly in England, it's wind farming. They're on an island, so they're not going to have a lot of hydroelectric because there's not a lot of elevation for water to start high up and then move its way down. So they're not going to have that hydroelectric option. And then the amount of wind that comes off the ocean, why wouldn't they do wind energy? It's very low cost and it's very abundant. And we can see that now a lot of their energy is made up of these renewables, specifically England. One problem though, the wind has slowed down this year and through the summer. That means the natural gas has had to try to meet that capacity. Because just because the wind has slowed down doesn't mean that you're going to cook less, turn on less lights, etc. So they've shifted to using more and more natural gas.
And that's that natural gas spike in price that you saw up over 110 euros, back down around 90, but so still highly elevated.
And they've really spent down a lot of their excess supply that they had of natural gas. Because when you have renewables, it is dependent upon the weather, and the weather is fickle. So to try to deal with that capacity problem in a low-cost, low-carbon emitting way, you have a lot of natural gas plants. So that's been part of the case, and they're really struggling there because we don't know when the wind is going to kick back up to meet some of their demand, and they're running low on, and everyone's in Europe running low on natural gas.
I was looking at Morningstar's projections for where the U.S. will be 10 years from now, because the U.S. does not look like this. The renewables are not that high currently. And their projections in 10 years show that it's going to look very similar to this. I think you're going to make the case that that's probably a little too soon.
I think we are a little too soon on these renewables, and we'll get into that. But it's not just a perfect storm in England. It's not happening in one area. In South America, they have really the biggest river, right? They have an enormous amount of water coming in the rainforest. But they're also experiencing a drought. And there was actually one collapse. I don't think it's necessarily because of the drought or because of rain. It just, they did have a dam collapse here recently. But we can see that there's a drought on the Amazon, and it's really not only having problems with the hydroelectric power generation there, but we're also seeing bottlenecks in the ability to ship on waterways. One of the things with a dam is it allows waterways to be more stable, so you can control the depth. So it's not just a big flood and then back to a normal small river. You can actually have that. So there's been some issues with the waterway on commodities. Now that drought is not just in South America. If we look here locally and we go to the state of Washington, we can see the amount of hydroelectric power that they are using to power their state is pretty much the dominant source of electricity. But they're also experiencing a drought. One of the issues with using weather-related energy production in an environment where you're trying to offset climate change is that the climate would change, and you may be setting up renewables for a changing climate. So that's one of the issues that's there. It's not to say that there isn't any benefit from doing that, but it's not as resilient, especially whenever one of the reasons that you're doing it is because there is going to be change in climate.
How does the backup plan work, if there is one at all, for when kind of the energy is not participating, when you have problems with water, wind?
So I think that's a great lead into this picture. So in 2021, we had a Texas outage during the winter. And Texas, it may surprise people, it's because it's our biggest oil producing state historically. I don't know, I think it still is, I think it's still outproducing the Dakotas. But they have a lot of wind. And the way that wholesaling price works for electric companies, especially in Texas, is they have a certain amount of capacity that they have to provide, and they buy electricity that's being produced, and you got to buy the lowest cost first. Well, once you have a windmill or a solar panel up, there isn't a lower cost way of creating electricity. So Texas has actually grown to 30% of their energy capacity was windmills and solar panels. We had an ice storm. Snow covers the solar panels. Also, wind, they have to use a lot of the electricity if they're generating and trying to keep the windmill warm. So most of it is getting consumed by the actual individual windmill because they're all spread out. They don't have that concentration where they can keep each other warm. So then the 30% of their capacity went down, but it's a winter storm, so the amount of energy use is going up. And typically what they do is they just fire up the natural gas. Now, policy error, Texas did not winterize effectively, so then they also lost their natural gas. But if you think about it, if 30% of your capacity is coming offline because of weather, and that's likely increasing the demand need, and you only have 70% left, that's a pretty big strain on the power system. So we don't have a lot of the smart grids and other things already put in place, so we're lacking a lot of resiliency in our electric power distribution system that will probably be solved over time. There's a better battery use, there's the ability to actually pump air down into the ground and then release it, but we're a little ahead of ourselves being so dependent on this low cost, low emitting energy source, and we're starting to see some disruptions there.
I don't think we have a slide for it. We were talking about before about how interest rates play a role in the energy space. Can you explain that a little bit?
Interest rates are basically the way that you determine consumption now versus consumption later. And for consumption later, you're going to make an investment. And if interest rates are artificially moved, there can be things that are missed when you're trying to project out. It's not that renewables are a bad idea. We want low-cost energy. But if we're discounting them or we're using a lower interest rate, that future economic benefit looks a lot bigger than if we were using a higher interest rate. So this transition and this investment into renewables is going to speed up, and we may not actually have, over the next 5 to 10 years, the ability or see it in that discounted cash flow on how we're under-investing in the old fossil fuels. They're not going to be an adequate enough bridge to get us there, and I think that is what's happening. Because if we look out, how many people want to be a coal miner? Right? So we can see that coal mining as jobs has gone down dramatically because what typically was a career. Do you really want to start a 30-year career that from everything that you're seeing and reading and all the investment flow is basically going elsewhere? You don't want to be a coal miner. You want to go up and you want to work on windmills. You want to do something else. So we actually have a shortage of miners as well as a shortage of the ability to produce a lot of coal. And there's now a big demand for coal to try to offset this. So Europe specifically is scrambling to get coal because the windmills, whether in Germany or England, are low. But at the same time, we also see the problems in China. And they're doing things to resolve it. One of the ways that they have set up coal pricing in their utility system is the utility provider can only pass on a 10% increase to its users. And with this sharp increase in coal, they were actually losing money for every unit of energy that they were providing their users. So China is actually liberalizing that component where they can do a 20% increase or a 20% decrease to give them some ability to recoup, because you can't lose money and then make it up with volume, right? In addition, there is an issue between China and Australia on being able to purchase coal and use Australian coal. They've kind of waived that right now, so they are using it. But it's not just China. It's a global market. We're also seeing India hit by coal supply or lack of coal supply and creating outages there. And we can see the coal supply shortage and the price of power. So this is a global phenomena that is very complex. I'm not trying to oversimplify here, but that we may have gotten a little ahead of ourselves with the renewables. And the reason is it's not because renewables are a bad idea. It's because we've sacrificed low cost, low emission for good reasons, and instead do not have resilient power supplies or power creation or even supply chains wrapped around this. So we're just starting to see these problems, and we don't really see an easy out from the problem. So one thing is, in Europe, if Russia was all of a sudden able to increase the amount of gas that they are providing Europe, that would help. Not sure if it's politics or not. I promise you there is some politics. I don't know if it's all politics or if there's some supply chain disruptions because of lack of investment in Russian gas pipelines and other things. So it's just hard to tell where we are on that. But the supply chains is another component that this is going to have. We're already seeing disruption in supply chains coming out of China to the U.S., right? Well, if you now have to compete for shipping space to transfer natural gas or coal, etc., that's just going to compound that problem. One thing is we're a little bit sheltered here in the U.S. Because though natural gas there are global supply chains, they're not really able to deal with the capacity needs. So we see prices in Europe. To give you an example, the price of natural gas on equivalent energy production for oil would be $205 a barrel of oil. Right now, oil is trading at a 7-year high at $80. So that's $205 versus $80. So to kind of give you the price shock, instead of having a $3 a gallon gas, just kind of taking that basic math out to $205 would mean a $7 to $8 a gallon gas fill up. So there's a lot of disruptions that are showing up. In addition, we're starting to see disruptions in the food supply. So if energy prices go up and food is so dependent upon it, as an example, the Netherlands, I didn't know this until this crisis, actually produces a large amount of the agricultural products consumed in Europe. U.S. is ahead, but the Netherlands, it's not really a place that's going to have a big warm climate that's year-round. It's not that warm. So what they do, they use greenhouses. Well, greenhouses heat themselves and are highly dependent upon natural gas, and they can't afford to stay on because food prices are not. So either food prices have to go up substantially or natural gas prices need to come down. In addition, ammonia, carbon dioxide, all of these are needed for food production. And it's very, very energy intensive to the point that the renewables, windmill and others, hydroelectric could do it, but the more dispersed energy can't actually provide enough energy to do this thing. So they're very dependent upon fossil fuels on creating this, and this is very dependent upon food. So they're actually starting to see some shortages. Now, it's not just a simple thing of shortages because of energy or because of food. There's also things like labor shortage for trucking. You were going to say something?
I was just going to say we did get new inflation numbers today, the CPI, which was headline, which includes food and energy, was up 0.4 on the month, and core, which removes those numbers, was only up 0.2. So I was just curious if you had any opinions on that, where we're going to see that going.
I personally don't like separating the two because I don't know about you guys. I have to buy energy and food every month, so I can't be like, well, the energy and food prices are high, so I'll just not purchase them this month. So those are felt, and if the money supply is fairly stable, so the Fed and the central banks are not printing, if you do see an increase in food and energy, being that that's such a dominant part in most people's purchases, you would actually have to see core drop down some, because you would have less money for those other items.
Which is what we saw in continuation of from August and September.
Right. So, and the money supply has basically been stable. You can only see a rise in both whenever there's just more money around to chase those goods. So, I don't. It's not that it's not useful. I don't like separating those because I know we can't separate them in our household. So supply chain disruptions and shortages, the energy issue is only going to compound that and make that difficult. And there are things that the market's trying to figure out. We saw that Walmart, Target, and a lot of the retail companies are starting to charter their own private shipping containers because the disruptions been so high and so painful there. And we're seeing shortages, not just in the UK, but we're seeing shortages here. This is not catastrophe. I just think we're going to see shortages and higher prices in the U.S. Relative to many other places, it's not as bad here as it is there. But there are some things that I think people can consider whenever we're looking at this. One, start your shopping for Christmas early, and this is kind of across the board. I'm seeing this as a recommendation from fund companies, from distributor companies. There's just not going to be a lot on the shelf if you wait too long. So begin that shopping early. If you're concerned about a power outage, I don't think it's a really big high probability here in Missouri, which I'll get into, and you like to camp. Maybe it's time to get that sleeping bag, that tent, some alternative lights, just in case we had that Texas-like experience where you are, where there's a week of time. Because you could set that tent up and have that sleeping bag and have some lights, especially if you have plenty of batteries, and maybe even make some fun out of it. One thing, once again, we're not against renewables. Remember, the problem is resiliency for the system. If you have the means, you may want to consider a whole home solar panel system, because if you can help produce electricity, that's going to add to that resiliency, especially if you have a whole home system where you're not dependent upon the grid, that if the grid was down, that you could help at least produce some for your lights and keep your refrigerator going. There are tax incentives to do so, so it may not be a full cost. In addition, one of our concerns is inflation. If you are able to sell back your utility, your excess electric, and basically what you're doing is trading some type of financing option or a lump sum payment, this is a way to have an inflation hedge if electric power prices do increase. So it's a consideration. Once again, we're not against renewables. Wood burning insert stoves, especially if you're in the cold area. I probably wouldn't do this if I was in Florida. But wood burning stoves actually are fairly efficient to the point that the government will give you a 25% credit for some of them that are hitting that 85% efficiency or above. So you would not be dependent upon the utility company, the natural gas and electric. Once again, I don't think that's going to be an issue for our Missouri residents, but there may be some states that are highly dependent upon renewables that you may want to consider some of this. Also, buying your food from local farmers. Because one of the issues with the food is just the transportation costs. If you have food being grown in CAFO organizations somewhere far away and they have to travel, a lot of that price in your food is actually price of transportation. And a lot of the renewables is trying to lower the impact of that carbon footprint. A local farmer would be a closer option. You could have that relationship. A lot of people think it's and would advocate that it's healthier. It's certainly grown in a more sustainable way. A cow isn't going to be in like a little apartment complex from a local farmer. They're going to have it out in the field, so it's going to be out there fertilizing the grass, etc. And it may be a little bit cheaper if you buy in bulk. I would say that if you bought bulk conventional, it still would be cheaper to buy conventional meat. But you can bring some of that price down, and then you have that supply. So if supply chain disruptions happen, you kind of have some reserve there. If you do that and you have a freezer and you don't have that whole power, I would recommend a backup generator to have, so you can keep your freezer full of food, because you don't want to have all this food sitting there, have a power outage, and then lose your food. And the thing I want people to take away, we're for renewables, we're for all kinds of diverse energy production, but fossil fuels are not they're not just evil, they're not antiquated, they're just a bridge that can help us meet there. And I think that we've gotten a little ahead of ourselves on the investment in low cost energy instead of looking at some of the resiliency, and we're starting to see that here globally. And if we were looking, once again, I've said I don't think Missouri is going to have a lot of problems. We're still very much a coal-fired dependent energy state, so coal doesn't seem to have this disruptions. I would expect to see prices higher on your utility bill because it's easier to ship coal. So these crises that are in India and Europe and China are showing up in the price of thermal coal. So I would expect to see your utility bill higher, but we'll probably have a pretty resilient system here in Missouri. I don't think we'll experience a rolling blackouts like they did in Texas. So now we're going on to the market. So when we look at the price points, I'm a little concerned here. We're starting to see that 50-day moving average flatten out. It's called a kind of a rollover. That means you're shifting from an upward trend to a downward trend. And then we continue to move on that trend. We could see that going down. Still a lot of money in investment accounts, but you know, we could see, I think we were talking about an air pocket. Whenever you're flying and all of a sudden you hit an air pocket, the plane does that and then starts to climb out of that. So wouldn't be surprised to see that.
We're actually entering earnings season right now. Banks kicking it off today, and so that'll be kind of topics of weeks going forward. And actually, we don't have it on this graph here, but some of the choppiness up to this point, where you can see some of those pullbacks throughout the year, were correlated with earnings season. So expectations are coming down a little bit this year, so potential for upside beats could help also be a catalyst to turning this around.
And with supply chain disruptions and inflation showing up,
that's bringing the expectations down.
those expectations down. In addition, this is another way to look at the money supply numbers that we look at. We've certainly slowed from what we were growing from a year, and we're actually kind of trending down here flat. If there wasn't an infrastructure bill, I'd want to be a little bit more defensive. But if that infrastructure bill passes, we'll see that money supply pick back up, and we'll see the market run. And if it doesn't pass, and we continue to see money supply, there's likely that it will pass because they'll bring it back on to try to solve the problem. So it's a difficult market. Know that we are making changes for portfolios, especially on the qualified side where taxes are not an impact. We continue to say for the next couple of months, I think it's going to be choppy. We could see some of those air pockets. 12 months from now, though, we're likely to be up. In addition, like we mentioned last week, the U.S. dollar and U.S. Treasury bills are now above the S&P 500 whenever we're measuring the technical indicators. That's once again showing caution. Know that we are making changes, especially in accounts that don't have taxes involved on the trade. Any other comments that you want to make?
No.
All right. Well, we hope that you enjoyed this call. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and click that subscribe button. If you enjoyed this content or want to hear more about ESG investing, click like. I'll interpret it the way that I want to interpret it. And if you have any questions, feel free to call us at the number on the screen or go to our website and ask to speak with a lead advisor. We appreciate you tuning in this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.